come sit down. Start. Welcome. Okay. So I'm going to say a brief story about our friend here, Marcus Roberts. And I don't know if I've ever told you this story. Maybe I did. But the first Shabbat that I was in Oxford, I ended up sitting next to this guy in the Cloud House. I don't know if you remember.
I do remember, yes.
We were talking over dinner. And, I come from Canada. And at the end of dinner, I assumed, since everybody has stereotypes and prejudices, the way Marcus was speaking, I assumed he wasn't Jewish. And at the end of dinner, it came out that he was Jewish. We were talking. And I never met a Jewish person that had such an accent. It was very interesting. From the suburbs of Montreal, so,
Oy vey.
That was 30 years ago, 30 plus years ago. So it's really a pleasure that Marcus Roberts is here. As you will hear this morning, he's doing really important, he's done very important research and work, actually groundbreaking research. And he'll explain what happened in Alderney, where he really single-handedly, and he's modest, but was really a driving force to uncover the Holocaust taking place in the United Kingdom. It's something that was actually covered up for decades, and Marcus, with lots of opposition, was really steadfast in incredible research. Marcus is the founding director of J Trails, the National Anglo-Jewish Heritage Trail, and a professional heritage consultant working nationally and in Europe with religious and minority cultural heritage and buildings. He's a qualified teacher who has also been worked as a professional tour guide and has run his own heritage tour business in Oxford. He's been involved in many issues, and you can read his bio, and I won't just read what's already in the book. But really, amazing research, and he's written widely, student at Oxford and a research fellow here.
Not a research fellow here. I'd like to be.
Oh, you'd like to be.
Yeah, I work, currently I'm also working with the Oxford University Jewish Country House project, so that's my direct Oxford link. So when the Holocaust is getting a little wearing, I go and visit Waddesdon and the Rothschild House for a bit of chocolate box Jewish heritage. Very important.
The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Yes, I was just going to say that my feeling with these conferences is that I'm drawing on everybody's collective wisdom. I don't purport to have all of the answers, and today I'm going to be asking some questions. I may be right or I may be wrong in what I say, but I'd be interested in what you've got to say, and whether the concerns which I raise are justifiable. It's interesting to see all the different styles of presentation. I won't be doing Uzzi's dance with knowledge, where he probably does about 10,000 steps per session. I'll be saying static here. What I'll be going through is, kind of fairly conceptual, but I managed to sneak in a few pictures and video just to lighten the load as we go along. So I'll be talking for just about an hour, maybe slightly more. I might have to skate over a couple of things just to keep the time down, because I obviously prefer to have reasonable time for discussion in the last half hour, but obviously you're very welcome to speak to me afterwards as well. So the title of the talk is, Did the UK Alderney Review on the 22nd of May 2024 finally deliver Holocaust justice or denial? So in 2022, the government published a report by 12 academics and experts on the Channel Islands history to address specifically the numbers of prisoners brought to Alderney who died at the hands of the German occupiers. But of course, this report has quite a long hinterland of history to it. I wasn't the first person to raise the issues involved, and I particularly give credit to Solomon Steckel, an Israeli South African journalist who really blew the lid on the British cover-up of German war crimes in Alderney. And in a sense, a lot of what I say now is a sort of a spin-off, in fact, from the Eichmann trial in 1961. So Steckel worked on the Eichmann trial. He received information from Bureau 6, the Jerusalem police, and that was when he first became aware of war crimes in the Channel Islands. So he only published his book in, I think it was 1982, on the Alderney death camp. So an Israeli was extremely important in this story. I was introduced to it back in October 2008. I'd previously been doing work in the Nord-Pas-de-Calais on the Jewish slave labour camps in that region around Boulogne, Camier, Dan, etc. I'd been asked to contribute to the Camps and Ghettos Encyclopedia on that history. So I was very interested to be introduced to Professor Caroline Sturdy-Coles, who was then Caroline Coles, by a mutual tutor who said, "You're doing very similar work." I was looking for mass graves in the Nord-Pas-de-Calais area. She was starting to look at mass graves issues in Alderney. And we had a meeting in October 2008 in which she showed me these Allied aerial images. So here we have the recognised slave labour cemetery, but she pointed out to me these anomaly areas here, and she said that in her view these were likely to be mass graves and that more people died on Alderney than had been given credit. This is important because the government blames me and alt-right trolls and conspiracy theorists for raising this question, but in fact it's one of the panel members who actually started the ball rolling in more recent times. To give it a bit more of the backstory, all of his issues about mass graves and how many died had been simmering under the surface, being conducted at a relatively polite level. But then in 2016, one of the state's members in Alderney phoned me up and said, there's a drilling rig on Longy Common. I fear they're going to disturb the war graves, the Holocaust graves. The graves are all in this area up here. There were plans to put a massive interconnector cable between France and Britain right across the site, and suddenly I was drawn into a campaign to save the graves. In fact, locals said, please do your best to save the Holocaust graves. Some obviously simply didn't want the cable, and it was convenient to ask me along because of that. The states of Alderney, who are the autonomous government of Alderney, the states, I should mention that the Channel Islands are a British sovereign realm, but they do have their own governments.
Excuse me, I'm very sorry, but I think in this room there are many people who are not even aware about what this side, or what is the history behind this side.
Yes.
Could you please make some...
Yes, sure. So all will be revealed, but I should have mentioned that the British Channel Islands lie between the south coast of Britain and the coast of France. They're actually slightly closer to France than they are to Britain. There's a series of islands. Jersey, Guernsey and Alderney are the largest and most important. They were part of the Duchy of Normandy, so when William the Conqueror conquered England, he was king both of the Channel Islands, Normandy and the UK. So for a long time, the Channel Islands were essentially French, but in the last couple of hundred years, they've become predominantly English and English-speaking, even though there's a French patois called Jerryese, which still just about survives in Jersey. During World War II, the British government demilitarised the Channel Islands. Churchill decided not to defend the Channel Islands. Someone forgot to send the memo to the Germans who bombed Guernsey and killed about 8 or 9 people at St. Peter Port. The Germans then realised that there was an open door. They came in their many thousands, and they then decided to construct part of the Atlantic Wall in the Channel Islands. In fact, a large portion of the effort of the entire Atlantic Wall was poured literally into the Channel Islands. A huge amount of concrete, about 12% of the concrete that was poured went into Alderney, and half of the excavation that went on took place in Alderney. So they turned the islands into what they regard as an impregnable fortress. So the British realised that it would take a force of 500,000 men to take the islands and then to hold them for 48 hours. So that was the situation. It was, in my view, something of a disgraceful episode that they gave up the Channel Islands. And in the haste of the evacuation, some of the Jews who were on the island were left behind in the melee. Foreign-born Jews who had escaped to the Channel Islands were left behind, and much to the shame of Britain, British officials played a part in the deportation of those foreign-born Jews to German camps. The German edicts were passed into British law, so the royal seal was put onto German edicts. That's some of the background. It's very shameful, and there's a lot of issues about, say, collaboration and questions which were simply too toxic, I think, at the end of the war for the British to answer. So anyway, I was invited by the States of Alderney to talk about the issue of the graves. Graham here is one of the States members, and I came with Rabbi Ginsberg, so we were supplying, insight into the halakhic approach to graves. The States of Alderney were in agreement with us that there shouldn't be disturbance of graves. And Ray Godian, who died a few weeks ago, sadly, is a very well-known local figure who, as a curious 15-year-old, working part-time as an undertaker, got access into the exhumation of the graves by the War Graves Commission, and he confirmed, along with other islanders we've spoken to, that quite a number of bodies were left behind in the grave pits. The issue about the truth in Alderney was racked up when I was given a copy of the Pantchev report from the Moscow State Archive. At the end of, in 1945, when the islands were liberated, the handful of Brits who were in Alderney collared the liberators and said the Germans have whipped to death, many hundreds of prisoners. And George Pope in particular talked about 300 to 400 Jews who died and were buried on Longy Common. And Brigadier Snow, who strangely enough spoke fluent Russian, instantly asked some of the Russian prisoners there what was going on, and an inquiry ensued which rapidly was taken over by MI5, with an inquiry headed by a young Captain Pantchev. Pantchev eventually became number 2 in British intelligence, so he's a really important figure in intelligence history. His report on war crimes was focused just on the Russians, and the copy was sent to the Russians, and they were told, if you want to prosecute this, you do it. Now, it was all a bit of a stitch-up, really, and they've just admitted that they actually covered up the fact that, they'd covered up the war crimes, but now blame the Russians for not having prosecuted. In any case, we had a double-page spread story in the Sunday Times, written using my material by Gabriel Pogrund, the Journalist of the Year. So the British establishment felt that they couldn't really ignore this emerging story. And also, Colonel Kemp and his colleague John Weigold advanced an account of the occupation history in the Daily Mail, stating that the Germans had intended to use V1 weapons on Alderney, and Kemp and Weigold claimed deaths of around 40,000 prisoners. Now, I personally think the numbers were a bit on the high side. At the time, I gave them advice. They wanted to argue it deductively in terms of how much work had taken place, and that it was, in a sense, a quantity surveying issue. I mean, I'm sympathetic with that, but I said, unless you're seriously taking into account the actual written records, it's just not going to go down so well with the historians, whether or not you're correct. And in fact, their claims of 40,000 plus deaths have been a key target in the Alderney review. So, in 2023, the pressure had continued to mount, and it was agreed that there would be a review into the deaths on Alderney. The British government were about to take the chair of the IHRA, and I'd said that there are still Holocaust secrets to be released, and the British government have still not admitted that they covered up both war crimes, but also had thwarted Holocaust justice, particularly for the French Jews. This was not, well received, but clearly, despite the chagrin shown to me about this, it was decided that they needed to answer these allegations before they could take the chair of the IRA and the credit for doing so. So the review. All right, so I'm missing a couple of slides here. The review was published, but not before I'd done some filming with CBS for 60 minutes, which I'm told is no small achievement. CBS did a very nice job, actually. You can view it online. So I was saying, this is where the Holocaust happened on British soil. And this tunnel here is infamous in French Jewish survivors' memory as being the site where the Germans had intended to kill them in the event of D-Day landings. One end of it was closed up, and the prisoners either said that they thought they were going to be asphyxiated in the tunnel, but later on, Albert Eblegon, who became the leader of the Survivors Association, the Political Survivors Association, described the two rehearsals where they were heard in there as gassing trials, was how he described it. So the review came out. I would point out that even though my organisation, J-Trails, has been a major stakeholder in this right since 2008, we were explicitly told that we were not invited and we were not welcome, and that we would be a distraction at the press launch. I have that in writing from Lord Pickles, and journalists said to me that quite a lot of the proceedings were somewhat levelled at the positions that I'm alleged to have taken. I mean, in actual fact, they did tend to set up a number of straw man positions to take down. They didn't do a very accurate portrayal of what had been said, but nonetheless, that's what happened. Now, there are obviously some major pros for the report. I'm not going to underestimate the importance that the British increased the official number of deaths threefold, from 358 in 1945 to around 1,100 now. So that's important. But I would note that there was only an increase by 200 from the numbers that had been published 3 years previously by two of the academics, Sturdy, Colson, Carr. They only differed by 200 from numbers they'd reported 2 or 3 years earlier. The British government said there had been considerable brutality as well as murders in the camps. Vitally, they admitted there was a British cover-up of war crimes in alleged connivance with the Russians, though they said it was a multi-layered cover-up, with Russians being ultimately blamed. Now, in actual fact, I had supplied a 13-page report on secret documentation to the chief advisor to Lord Pickles, Anthony Gleeson, in which I mentioned all of this. I said it was actually a multifactorial cover-up. So this was an important admission. They did say that the Holocaust happened on Alderney, but they allowed the press to widely report that there were only 8 Jewish deaths. Now, all the other deaths counts have been increased threefold, but the 8 Jewish deaths simply kept the number of Jewish deaths at exactly the number in 1945. There are 8 official Jewish graves, so that was reported to be a key aspect of the finding of the Holocaust. And in fact, one well-known journalist and historian, Guy Walters, said that basically it meant that the Holocaust sort of hardly happened on Alderney. The other point that they agreed was that there's still burials on Longy Common. They said 12. So for years we'd been arguing there are still burials there. I think there's more, but nonetheless having that admission I think is important. So did they apologise? Well, Lord Pickles certainly mentioned about the succession of cover-ups, and crucially they said the cover-up was about obtaining SS war criminals who'd killed the British POWs who broke out at the Great Escape. This was apparently the motive for the cover-up. Lord Pickles said it was a stain on the reputations of successive British governments. Professor Glees gave a somewhat more nuanced take on it in a newspaper article. He said, well, we could apologise, but transparency is more important. And then he parked the blame on the Russians. I mean, our Russian back channels have indicated they're not happy with that. They said it was the British responsibility to prosecute, not the Russians. And of course, let us not forget that most of the Russian returnees had to go to filtration camps, and a great many were branded traitors and had long periods in the Gulag. Prisoner Kondakov made it back to Russia and then spent 15 years building the Trans-Siberian highway for his pains. Now, with all of this, once again, you've got to find the facts rather than just listen to the assertions. So definitively, the UK government started the fire, as it were. They were the first people to talk about slave labourers, mass killings, mass graves, extermination in the Channel Islands. For example, in this report about Guernsey, recorded in Hansard from February 1944. They said specifically that the Russians were killed in large numbers and that their bodies were dumped on waste ground and then covered with quarry waste. So it was the British government who actually started these allegations, not conspiracy theorists decades later. Now, if we're going to look under the hood of the inquiry, there are a number of significant issues. I maintain that the inquiry completely failed to engage with or understand the actual historiography of the dispute, and they thereby comprehensively mischaracterised the dispute about numbers and the legitimacy of the players in the dispute, simply labelling them as conspiracy theorists and Holocaust distorters. Now, in reality, the dispute about numbers goes back to wartime itself, but then also principally to the publication by Panchev, the investigator, in his Alderney story. I got the wrong date, 1981. Panchev's death count was basically based on the number of crosses and graves, but 2 mass graves were opened, but no report exists as to exactly what was found and why initially they said apparently that they were French Jews and then they were converted to Russians. Critically, Charles Cruikshank, who's a highly respected historian, produced his seminal official history of the German occupation of Channel Islands in 1975, which, in my view and many people's view, was a rather anodyne establishment production, largely supporting the idea of a German model occupation, and which affirmed Panchev's Alderney account and deaths number. He particularly said that the German records of prisoners' death were honest records, even though there are multiple sources in the British investigation where the Germans themselves said that deaths were falsified and most records were taken away or missing at the end of the war. In 1981, Panchev published his Fortress Island with one of the current panellist members, Colin Partridge, acting as his chief assistant. It was a reaction to a book in preparation by Solomon Steckel, who had been part of the Eichmann trial in '61. Steckel had interviewed Panchev, so clearly the alarm went out and Panchev was trying to counter this revisionist history in production. Steckel's Alderney death camp blew apart the official UK narrative, with well-supported allegations of a major British cover-up of German ill deeds, injustice and large-scale deaths. This was followed up in 1991 with the excellent book by Madeline Bunting, The Model Occupation, which was, in fact, she was assisted by Professor Anthony Glees, who also featured on the review, and she took up and supplemented these themes with information gained from newly opened archives. So she read the Panchev report in the Moscow State Archive. And as Dan Mickman says, the opening of these archives in general was a key event in Holocaust scholarship, and also the need to cope with the local past. I remember in the 1990s, I used to go drinking with Professor Norman Stone, who was well known for his World War II histories, and he would be very enthusiastic about his latest discovery in the Russian archives. That was quite a vivid experience I had. So it's important to point out that these revisionary and establishment, these revisionary histories and establishment histories concerning Alderney were produced absolutely in lockstep with the period in which Spycatcher in 1987 and The Ultra Secret appeared in 1974. There were books which challenged the establishment and revealed state secrets. So to engage those still engaged in the business of trying to reveal secrets as conspiracy theorists and distorters is denying the actual history and continuing process of challenging state control and secrecy in a non-deferential and digital age. The fact that we've got so much digital media means that we can find out so much more than we could even 5 years ago. And also we're in the position to challenge more. I was speaking to someone working for Accenture who said that Accenture, the management consultant company, put a lot of money into the ITS archive so you could do AI searches within documents, and that has produced some very interesting results in my work. In 1991, PM Margaret Thatcher commissioned a war crimes inquiry about the admission of former Eastern European Nazi collaborators who were allowed to settle in England and who had never been tried for significant war crimes. Professor Anthony Glees, who was on the inquiry, was an advisor on the war crimes unit in the Home Office. Whilst the review wasn't about Alderney, MPs Janet and Winnick raised parliamentary questions about Alderney war crimes, and particularly those of SS man Kurt Klebeck, who they accused of 350 murders. While it was not part of his main remit, and I really do emphasise this, Glees concluded and stated on the record, on the BBC radio, that there were about 16,000 prisoners in Alderney and about 3,000 deaths. And he reaffirmed these numbers to me and to Michael James in 2023. He said he stood by these numbers, as these numbers are always checked and double-checked, and I don't believe there's ever been any correction to this figure. So he is implying that this was actually a semi-official number. However, by the time he joined the review panel and the findings came out, he was solidly behind the 1,100 number from the panel. So I think it's important to kind of delve a bit further. So I mentioned that Colin Parker was part of the original narrative about Alderney produced by Panchev, and also Professor Glees, who's an intelligence and deception expert, was also involved in the 1991 review. So it's interesting that there's this state, or people involved with the security services. We found some quite, well, I think it's dramatic, I think it's important information. We now have evidence that the British intelligence covertly colluded to establish an official narrative in the Channel Islands and suppress undesired narratives and revisionist histories. So my colleague and trustee Michael James purchased Panchev's personal library from his estate, and then, mysteriously, an anonymous stranger came up to his house and left a plastic bag at the door of his house containing Panchev's personal correspondence for the period on his doorstep. The evidence in the letters showed that Cruikshank and Panchev colluded and worked together, apparently with state intelligence services, in producing official World War II narratives and suppressing revisionist histories. Panchev, when he retired, had been about to become number 2 in British, or was number in 2, and clearly, whilst he was a great patriot and a revered intelligence figure, he wasn't a Boy Scout, should we say. Cruikshank, it would appear, was actually a Whitehall insider. He was in the Ministry of Supply in World War II and worked in Whitehall up to his retirement in 75. He has a suspiciously slim biography, and he thanked many of the Whitehall officials who helped him in his work. So he's most likely to have had some intelligence association. Certainly in the correspondence we found, Cruikshank boasted to Panchev that Robert Armstrong had initially handpicked him to write a history of MI5. Armstrong was cabinet secretary under Margaret Thatcher from 79 to 87, and in 1986 Armstrong was the key witness for the British government as it sought to suppress the publication of state secrets in Peter Wright's Spycatcher. Armstrong is credited with and ridiculed for introducing the phrase economical with the truth into popular usage. Cruikshank himself specialised in intelligence histories and the history of British deception. Cruikshank, in one letter, expressed his great disapproval of the unauthorised secrets published in Spycatcher, and he discussed how the intelligence services employed plausibly independent authors to write histories that the public would then believe were gospel truth. So this must surely indicate that we have to have a certain element of caveat emptor around the narratives in his and Panchev's book. So Cruikshank said, there were some who said they had read the MI5 book, that it was well written and quite fit for publication. That led my suspicious mind to ask, had I been asked to do a sort of whitewash MI5 book written by MI5 chap? Highly suspicious. MI5 book written by a simpleton outsider, the gospel truth. 2 years ago, Peter Wright began to loom large, and thought therefore might have been a case for a simpleton book to counter him. Idea now is that Hinsley would do the rewrite. I mean, you can read that how you wish, but it's very indicative, I think. So other Panchev letters show that Panchev had to have all his publications censored by the MOD before publication. So his book Fortress Island had to pass British security before it was published. He also concluded with a major publisher of wartime histories to vet and block unwelcome narratives. For example, a counter-narrative to the Cruikshank account by Peter King, which I'll talk about in a minute. He also blocked an account by a Jersey man of his deportation from Jersey to a German prison camp as part of the group of 2,300 British subjects who were sent to Germany as a Nazi reprisal in 42 and 3. And also we have letters where various spooks are writing to Panchev expressing regret that they've not managed to block certain biographical details about him going into publication, or saying that they've had words with various people to ensure that what they say is agreed with the security services. So it's a worrying matter that the two seminal historians of the German occupation of Channel Islands and Alderney, who were of course signatories to the Official Secrets Act and experts in state deception, should be the people who lay down the main framework by which we understand the occupation narrative. That does concern me. And certainly their advocation of honest German documents and statistics shouldn't be necessarily read uncritically. And certainly they did not rely on, in any significant way, on witness testimony and other sources. Certainly the review panel themselves, when it came to it, said that witness statements provided atmosphere, information on conditions of life and death, and subjective responses by prisoners. They, in my view, forgot the collective power of the prisoner testimony, and whilst the prisoners give differing numbers, talk about large daily numbers of death, and there is an approximate triangulation among a number of these reports. So I'm not saying the prisoners were right, but I think that what they said needs to be taken seriously and needs to be factored in, particularly since it's so far apart from what's now the official narrative. So here's a discussion about, how the Alderney Review regarded eyewitness accounts. The greater level of accuracy when it comes to describing conditions of life and death. They're better in conveying atmosphere. Well, that's what we really want, atmosphere, isn't it? A place to look for personal opinions, subjective situation appraisals and motivations. Interesting. Obviously, I've worked with quite a number of Holocaust survivors over the years. Obviously, I know about the problems with witness memory, but let us remember that many of the key witnesses were interviewed as part of a criminal investigation, with some literally being interviewed immediately after the release. 3 of the prisoners said, we were released from Alderney prison this morning, and now we're talking to you. And also, Panchev screened 3,300 prisoners remaining on the islands before he selected his interviewees. So he obviously selected the people he thought would give the best information. And of course, Panchev was a very experienced interrogator in the London cage. So we're not talking amateurs here in the intelligence gathering game. And there are instances where prisoners make factual errors and they're forced to correct them by the interviewers. So to say, so for the Alderney Review to talk about people who question the history as being influenced by the post-truth age and the obsession with fake news spread by alt-right trolls and others, just haven't quite got the history. Obviously, it's an easy way to diminish the legitimacy of those questioning what they're saying, and it could be a way of demonising as well. Peter King's book, which criticised Cruikshank, laid into the book saying that it was a very anodyne production. Cruikshank gives the impression that the German occupation was not an unpleasant affair, but he almost entirely ignores the large body of evidence existing in memoirs and diaries, and of course does not use works like the von Alfsess diary from the other side or excellent series of publications by the Channel Islands Occupation Review. So he says a genuine history of the Channel Islands should cover all aspects of the occupation, and it will reveal that although less savage than in neighbouring France, it was still quite severe enough to cause large numbers of deaths, massive seizures of assets and damage to property, accompanied by various crimes and violations of the Hague Convention. This opens up the issue of the non-punishment of German war crimes on the island, including the disappearance of the island Jews and deaths in Alderney. So I think, Cruikshank, so Peter King gave quite a good, counter to Cruikshank's story. I've already mentioned that, in fact, this whole current cycle of questioning of the official narrative didn't come in the last decade from alt-right trolls, etc. But in fact, one of the panel members, Professor Sturdy Coles, started this in November 2008 when she invited me for a meeting to talk about this very matter. One of the local Holocaust survivors, Professor Michael Pinto-Jatinsky, who today has published his final instalment about his personal story as a member of the Kastner transport, has been very critical of the review. He's been an activist in Holocaust rights, working at high level in government as well. So he's a serious player. He questions the assertion of the review that peer review would be sufficient to settle the matter, and that it was a gold standard test. I've been involved in peer review, and they vary in quality, but peer review is more about determining the suitability of a work for publication rather than having a juridical function. So he also points out that 30% of the global total of Holocaust archaeologists served on the inquiry, despite the dubious relevance, in my opinion, of their specialism. So he points out that the the government players in the IRHR group and in the panel, the government panel, would have been important in offering evidence and testimonies based on their previous research, but he questions whether they should have been both witnesses and judges. My argument too is that this should have been an entirely independent affair without any link to the government, with people who are kind of fresh to it. And certainly, as Michael Pinto-Duchinsky says, he says the term expert has been used ambiguously. To have strongly grounded knowledge and strong opinions is different to being dispassionate in weighing evidence brought by others. And whilst Lord Pickles was going on about Holocaust distortion and the danger of Holocaust conspiracy theorists, none of whom are ever named or no examples are ever given, he says that the conduct of the review itself posed more danger to Holocaust truth. The risk is that the status of Holocaust studies stands to be damaged by the quarrels and bickering that have characterised bad-tempered disputes over many years among a small circle of specialists on the topic, some of them have been inquiry members. And he highlights the fact that there was an attack on pro-Israel commentator Colonel Richard Kemp, who is seemingly one of the high-total conspiracy theorists under attack. And he also mentions that they actually simply completely misrepresented what he'd said, suggesting that more than 160 victims died in Alderney, which he never, ever said. And he also mentions, 80 years later, Jewish, Israeli and German Holocaust scholars still tend to have different approaches. Though not universal, it makes the composition of the panel feel uncomfortable from a Jewish viewpoint. And this is a question that I actually particularly want to get feedback from yourselves on. Michael Pinto-Duchinsky laid out 5 key conditions for an effective and objective review. He said that all the documents used by the inquiry should be available. They weren't, and there were no new disclosures. He asked, has the inquiry succeeded in tracing all shipping movements to and from Alderney 1940 to 45? No, there was no shipping list, no comprehensive list of transports, which in his view were necessary to be able to conclude that they'd come to a definitive determination as to how many prisoners were brought to Alderney and how many potentially died. And he said, will the report give maximum as well as minimum likely totals of deaths? So in fact, the report focused on producing a master list of names, which they previously called certain deaths, which had been compiled for the writing of Adolf Island. So her previous highest total number of deaths was 936 individuals. The panel added just some 200 more additional deaths to the number, which appear to have been on the basis of some form of estimation, but the workings were not clearly shown. So in my view, and I'd like your opinion on this, the major failing of the review is it's failed to do the hard work of strenuously estimating deaths, which witnesses universally estimated to be somewhere in the early thousands. Thus, it failed to give a genuine estimate of maximum probable deaths, only completing half of the task. So, I think there has to be an element. I had a discussion with Dan Mickman about this last year. There has to be an element of estimation based on best evidence and stating probability, if I understood what you said last year. Certainly, there's kind of confused use of numbers. So they talk about the 8 Jewish graves, but somewhere else they talk about 29 deaths on the Minotaur, missing out the 250 total deaths on the Minotaur, alluded to by many sources. They do talk about multiple mass shootings at the airport of Jews and political prisoners, which was 100 victims on several occasions, but that doesn't seem to get worked into the numbers. They talk about cliff edge shootings, which were a separate affair. Daumal claimed there were 7 cliff edge shootings of 50 men, so 350. So that's not really worked into minimum or maximum numbers. Michael also asked whether the research covered deaths of labourers en route to and from Alderney. As far as I can see, only 29 deaths on the whole are mentioned in this context. To me, there should be no fundamental distinction between deaths on Alderney or because of Alderney. It was all part of their Holocaust journey, and certainly the SS trial of Commandant List states that sick prisoners were sent back to Neuengamme camp to be exterminated and were removed on a regular basis. So there was a group of about 210 prisoners who were sent back to Neuengamme. Some of them escaped, and that's why the SS commandant was tried by an SS court. So in this case, I would say that the German record was certainly likely to be honest, since it was a court trial of SS. There's also an issue about transparency, which we won't discuss, but because it was not a public inquiry with standards of evidence and openness, we don't really know ultimately where some decisions came from. So other flaws, so there seem to be restrictive metrics of counting the dead. So the ignoring of eyewitness testimony. And whilst obviously coming up with specific numbers is not easy, when you survey what the prisoner said, they're talking about 50% plus death rates up to 80%. There's also a definite undercount of the prisoner cohort in the review. They said the maximum number of prisoners sent to Alderney were between 7,000 and 8,000. However, in January 1942, Commandant Hoffman says 7,000 prisoners arrived in that month alone. So it just doesn't quite add up. And also, they don't talk about the rolling numbers of prisoners. Sick and dead prisoners are replaced every 3 to 6 months. Panchev himself gives this 3-month number. I mean, if we look at a specific example, an MI19 report states that of a group of 2,000 Russians who were sent to Alderney in 42, 700 died in just 12 months, and that 40 out of 47 Russians working for company Olsch were killed. There are many such reports. The other key claim of the review is that there was no extermination through labour, and they said that the Germans were not trying to kill the prisoners. But as the former head of the Alderney Historical Society says, if you take prisoners to Alderney with hardly any clothing, you work them for 12 or 14 hours a day, you starve them, you dehydrate them, you beat them, you shouldn't be surprised if quite a large number died. I feel that there's an element of semantics involved about extermination or not, which I don't think is necessarily helpful, and they obviously wanted to talk about extermination centres like Treblinka, which are clearly quite a different case. But I don't think you can use that to say that there was no desire to kill prisoners. But that's something for you to feed back to me on. Now, in the case of SS Lager Sylt, the panel said only 100 prisoners died, and that was a key finding. And that was a key basis on which they said no extermination by labour. However, this ignores the prisoners sent back for extermination at Neuengamme. And also, I mean, one of the panellists had previously said that 210 prisoners were sent back to Neuengamme, but I'm thinking that she thinks that they survived because the Neuengamme KZ archive has about 110 Russian prisoners listed as dead from Alderney. So it doesn't really, the maths doesn't seem to work. And also, a few weeks ago, using the new search facilities on the ITS, I found an SS record of the transport to Solstedt camp from SS Lager Sylt, and I have the names and the numbers of the 441 prisoners who arrived. How long have I got? 5 minutes. Oh my goodness, I've gone on too much. Okay, pardon me. Right, so I would question this. I'm going to show you a few pretty pictures now. Well, not so pretty. So this is SS Lager Sylt. There's the boundary of the camp. You can see the various depressions where the camps were. That's the SS. That's the SS compound. I can tell you, doing drone footage near an airport is tough. And this is a prisoner's eye view point of the iconic gates of SS Lager Sylt. So you're passing from the SS compound to the prisoners' compound, and you can see the memorial placed by prisoners stating that some 400 prisoners died in 43 and 44 at Sylt. I cite various examples of rather larger numbers, sometimes based on what seems to be, actual documentary evidence. The report fails to talk about the fact that up till late 1942, prisoners were simply dumped in the sea, mostly off the breakwater here. There are massive rip currents and tides which would just flush the bodies away to the south coast of England. And some of the cliff shootings were in this area here at Bibet, around Bibet Head. There's also no mention of the execution wall. CSI experts from America with 30 years experience each said they would testify in court that this was a procedural execution site. So that's just a view of that, and you'll see once we move round and it pans up that this gate here is directly opposite the gate of Lager Helgoland. Incidentally, British intelligence says there were 600 Jews at Lager Helgoland. They're not talked about in the review at all. So panning up, and we can see the actual gates of Helgoland survive. They used to have an ornamental fountain just behind them. There's the issue of George Pope, who talked about a mass grave containing 300 to 400 Jews. We still don't have his full record. I now have new information about the gunnery regiment who excavated some mass graves, but once again, you cannot find files about what they found. And this is to show Longy Common. This is the anti-tank wall, which was said to have a 70% death rate. This bowl here is where the cemetery was. So the main actual cemetery was this rectangle here, and the possible Jewish graves are in this area over here. If I had a high definition video, you see some parallel lines. These are the crop marks from there. You can see the edge of the cemetery there.
These pictures are recent?
I took these during the drought 2 years ago. So it gave me the opportunity for an unparalleled look at parch marks. But it shows you how beautiful the island is, if you know. So I just want to, so there are various other Czech figures which suggest that the numbers are low according to what other scholars are saying. I've obviously done photogrammetry work to show that this area, which may be Jewish graves, still exists. And the report overlooks the fact that some of the most prolific murderers in the SS worked at an Alderney, including Kurt Klebeck, who was involved with the Einsatzgruppen, and was also the author of the Arkona disaster in 1945, with loss of 6,500 lives. And British judges who tried him for crimes at the Ireland camp near Hanover described his activities as conducting cheap forced labour and the slow, steady extermination of unwanted people. And in that camp, he is said to have killed 339 people. So if there was extermination, I'd say that this would characterise what was going on, but that in 1942, the rate may have been somewhat higher. So there's Klebeck there. And the panel also failed to take account of multiple charges by the United Nations War Crimes Commission against the SS. So top judges from 16 countries stated that there were incontrovertible charges of mass murder, massacre, murder, torture, terrorism, robbery, etc. So that's been missed out. So I submit that there may well have been a reductive metric used by the review, and that they've quite likely undercounted. But I am concerned that they may have distorted the actual IHRA definition of Holocaust distortion, which is about either excusing or minimising the Holocaust and the gross minimisation of the numbers of victims in contradiction to reliable sources. Nothing about Holocaust exaggeration. I mean, that's a slightly different matter, I think. But it's something that could be weaponised by other agencies in the future. I mean, I think the review was political, and politics and truth are not easy bedfellows. Politicians are concerned about what you do with truth rather than truth in itself. And that, at some point, will be my book. You see, it says Lloyd's Bank up there. So that I'm going to conclude at this point. I'm sorry, I seem to have. Did I overrun? Yeah. What time's lunch?
30 minutes.
In 30 minutes. All right. So we got time to talk. All right. Oh no, I thought I'd completely overrun. Phew, that's a relief. Well, thank you for being patient. As I say, I don't claim to have all the answers. I'm really keen for your collective wisdom here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. And which means that we really have to read the report. We haven't done it, but some short question. What do we know about the 8 Jews that are admitted to have been killed? Do we have more information about it, the background from where they were coming and so on? The second thing is, in what language were the testimonies that were used? Because there are many collections of post-war testimonies that can be checked. And you mentioned that in many cases they were only alluding to documents, but they don't show them. And one of the things I think that might be a deficiency of this report, that usually to this kind of inquiries, a whole series of documents are added in the appendix, because in order to show what the basis for the conclusions were. There's another issue that you mentioned, if there was an intent to kill. And that is, of course, a question, if there's an intention to kill all of the people, or that there is the intention to dispose of people who are not valuable anymore for the purposes of the camp. So that is something that has to be defined.
Yeah, you'll have to remind me of your questions, but in terms of the last question, drilling down into the facts and the information suggests that there were a number of things going on. That disparate groups of prisoners were being brought to the island, and clearly the Germans were able to treat different groups of prisoners in different ways, and that there were differing death rates. So just to say there was a homogenous policy towards the prisoners doesn't seem to be correct. So, for example, the Jews on Transport 641 from Drancy were, category C, non-deportables. They were half Jews and political prisoners. It would appear that the policy was to torture them to within an inch of their life, rather than to necessarily dispose of them. Whereas for the Russians got the worst treatment by far and most consistently. But then we have accounts of other possible Jewish groups starving and having a hard. So there are certainly different groups and different treatments. In terms of the 8 Jews at the cemetery, they're mostly described as Jewish resistance fighters. They appear to be Jews who had been arrested by the Gestapo. So we find prisoners being
France?
In France, yeah. So in terms of the letter we had from Panchev said that he was asked by a German researcher who he valued about the Jews, and he said that Jews deported to Alderney for non-racial reasons were simply categorized under their nationality. So there's lots of talks about French men being sent to Alderney, particularly early on. So it's quite likely that quite a number of them were Jews, even though they're not described as that. There were also prisoners who had been swept up, who'd been expelled from Alsatia at the beginning of the war. They often ended up in Alderney. They'd been rounded up by the Gestapo. There's the KZK who'd been rounded up in the port in Marseille. There was also some transports of prisoners, particularly Spanish Republicans, from the Vichy camps in the south. So you see a convergence of quite a number of different prisoner groups, some of which had Jewish prisoners. Then you have prisoners who've been brought in from Sachsenhausen in particular. So a lot of the German political prisoners there had been incarcerated as early as 1939 and seemed to have made it through the war. So you got asocials, work shy, and a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses. Clearly Hitler didn't like having the watchtower delivered to his door. And it seems that they were earmarked not to be killed during the course of the war. I presume they're in some kind of protective custody, but certainly you got this whole group of KZ prisoners as well. So it's a very mixed picture. Now, what's the other things you wanted to know?
The other thing was the testimonies, from where were they taken, from what collections and in what languages?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is that these were all collected by members of the London Cage, who were the expert interrogators who interrogated high-value prisoners. So they were linguists. So the original testimonies were recorded in the language of the prisoner, and you can see quite a number of those at the public record in Kew. And then they were translated by experts, and the prisoners were read the translation and asked to sign that it was a true reflection of what they said. And so, in fact, you can see, for example, Spanish testimony with the English translation. The Germans are so you can actually see that at Kew. So you can compare the two. So the evidential standards were very high, I would say. Was there something else you wanted to know?
Okay.
Yeah.
I have to think about it.
Yeah, the thing is, there's a refusal to publish the so-called master list of names. GDPR was cited as the reason not to publish names. It's data protection. So there was they announced, there are 400 Guernsey men and women were sent to Alderney to work. Yeah, we're going to show them that, we're not going to do it because of GDPR. And certainly the master list of names alluded to has not appeared. And so the thing is, it makes it very difficult to interrogate what they've done. So there's a lot of the time there's statements about what they're found, but unless you're able to hunt into some of the references they're given, it's not really, the workings are not sufficiently explicit.
Marcus,
Yeah.
thank you for the presentation, and I think it sheds a really valuable light on a subject that, of course, no one really knew about, and I, of course, commend you for getting the book out. Just a few points. I wanted to share my thoughts, especially as someone who had a legal fellowship at the Yugoslavia Tribunal in The Hague and investigated ISIS for war crimes and crimes against humanity. I mean, it really resonated with me, and I think the 2 points that came home were, one, it shows the great struggle of challenging official narratives, especially in this case, the fact that the British stood resolute as the island nation against the fascists, against the Nazis. But just in general, the great task of revising narratives, of trying to bring in other voices that we have talked about, I think, so far this week. And the other point is, I think it also shows sometimes the sheer centrality of Auschwitz in the Holocaust narrative. That's what people assume right away, conjure that image. And there are these other stories of the Einsatzgruppen, of the deaths in the ghettos, of disease and illness and sheer neglect, and the fact that the traditional focus, I think to a large extent, was on Eastern Europe. So it just shows that there are many more stories.
Yeah, well,
to be told. And the great book you probably know is Unfinished History by Dan Stone, David from London, that just came out that says, until the end of recorded time, there will always be something new, unfortunately, to find and explore about the Holocaust.
Picking up on this point about the centrality of Auschwitz, when I was younger, I met and spent time with people like Mel Mermelstein and Simon Wiesenthal, etc. So in my mind, Auschwitz was kind of very central. But it was a surprise, I suppose, to me later to realise how little I really knew. I met with Martin Dean from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and got involved with the Camps and Ghettos project, producing the text for the camps in northwest France. And, he showed me his slide presentation, 43 different camps, ghettos, prisons, 2,300 Zaufs, the camps just for Jews. It was an eye-opener. And of course, if you were to put a Google map, open a Google Earth map of Europe, you could alight pretty much anywhere on the map and find a serious Holocaust story. And of course, I used to talk about the Holocaust inside of Britain. So there used to be Jewish prisoners in 41 sitting in Sangatte camp, literally looking across to the white cliffs of Dover. And this is simply a story that people are not aware of. And also from my own family background, when I was a kid visiting my Oma and Opa in Holland, we'd all sit in the parlour and we'd have our cafe, and the special biscuit tin would come out. We'd only be allowed one biscuit, no more, never more than one biscuit. But then we'd talk about my mother's first cousins who were taken as slave labourers, but it was just sort of described to me as, the Germans took them off the street and Jan never came back. I mean, it was, it was totally sort of decontextualised history, but I suppose that was in the background of my mind. So this whole dialogue about slave labour, and of course when you look at Alderney, I mean, and a lot of these, if you look at a lot of these UNWCC texts, I mean, clearly anyone who didn't quite fit the German ideal could end up rapidly in a camp and dead. I mean, so I think in terms of victimology, you have to kind of understand that if you weren't what the Germans wanted or you were in the way, it wasn't about being Jewish or Roma or homosexual. Lots of other people, and there was a German who was in SS Lager Sylt. He had the Black Triangle for work shy. And he was asked by a German, why are you here? Are you lazy? He said. And the prisoner said, no, I had a job. The job ended. And I couldn't find another job, and they threw me into Sachsenhausen. And I managed to find his ITS record, and that's exactly the case. By the way, the other thing I should mention very quickly is completely random, but of course, I'd say lots of prisoners from Sachsenhausen ended up in Alderney. And of course, Sachsenhausen was the Berlin Olympics legacy, because the Olympic village became Sachsenhausen camp. So people talk about, Olympic legacy. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. Oh, so sorry. I apologize.
Thank you very much for the fascinating presentation, which is close to my heart, because I had a chance to assist my colleagues who were performing conflict archaeology of a mass grave and death marches in my country. And when doing that, I saw the range of methods that currently, in the 21st century, the conflict archaeology has in its arsenal, including microprobing and LiDARs and things like that. And this brings me to a question, perhaps naive. Who is the owner of the land currently? And what exactly prevents anyone, any researcher from a third country, any independent researcher, say, outside of money, what exactly prevents any independent research team of performing some non-destructive archaeological survey of the site? For example, LiDAR survey or something like that.
Well, you've put your finger on what has been a central issue. So I was invited to the party, should we say, in 2008 because the doctoral tutor for Caroline Sturdy-Coles was requiring her to produce an ethical framework for archaeological investigation of the Holocaust. And in particular, he flagged up that the archaeologist wanted to excavate a mass grave as a key part of her doctoral thesis. This is something which I think she will deny, but that's my recollection. And I was asked to advise her about the ethics of doing this. Now, obviously, I work closely with some Haredi and Lubavitch rabbis who are members of the European Committee for the Preservation of Jewish Cemeteries. So, yeah, I'm bound to say a no-dig policy, except in certain circumstances. So the way it worked was that Caroline did the stakeholder meeting with me and the rabbis. We did a trial of her methodology on the Northampton Medieval Jewish Cemetery in Northampton, which I identified. So she did a GPR survey, to show that she could work in an ethical fashion. And then we met with the Alderney Historical Society, who are obviously the local stakeholders. So it was agreed that she would use non-intrusive methods. So for a number of summers, she had summer schools where she brought students from Birmingham University, and I think later Staffordshire University, to help her conduct non-intrusive surveys. So, so that met with approval from Rabbi Ginsberg, Rabbi Gluck, and myself. That's clearly important to do. LiDAR or photogrammetry survey, great. However, it was alleged in 2016 that there was a desire to open one of the mass graves for the filming of a documentary called Adolf Island. Now, I should obviously emphasize that the archaeologist concerned denies that there was ever an intention to do so, but there was a hacked copy of the film pitch which suggested otherwise. So, I mean, I just simply say that without trying to say what was or what was not the case. But obviously we got somewhat exercised by this possibility, and certainly also we were aware that it might assist the potential desecration of the site by the Fablink cable. There was a 1.5 metre cable that was going to go across, and if it had been agreed, there would have been some kind of archaeology ahead of the cable. So the 2016 campaign was very much about trying to prevent any physical disturbance of the graves, and I wrote to the chief rabbi in 2018 on this matter, and he sent a letter to the government saying that the understanding in Jewish law was not to disturb. Now, I appreciate there are people out there say, well, why shouldn't we dig those graves and find out what's going on? I mean, I would like to, but that's just simply just going too far in the wrong direction. It's not respectful. It's all still in living memory, and it's against Jewish tradition. We maybe should wait for further increases in geophysical techniques to enable us to find more. I mean, certainly at present you can find out a lot. But yeah, it's tempting to dig and have a look, but I disagree.
The LiDAR survey does not require you to dig.
Yeah, well, there was a LiDAR survey done for Adolf Island, and it's published in there. And I also carried out my own photogrammetry survey in 2021 during the drought. And I got results that were pretty much as good as LiDAR because of all the vegetation that dry. So yeah, I strongly support all means of non-intrusive investigation in consultation with stakeholders. That's how it should be done,
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Building on what Isaac said and what yourself, your grandparents speaking to you, your family speaking to you, stresses the importance of oral history. And Isaac, building on what you were saying, I think your presentation really shows the vastness of the Shoah. For example, in Tromsø, Norway, there were 17 Jews, only 17 Jews that lived there. And the Nazis took the time to go 220 miles of north of Arctic Circle.
Yeah,
to take these, to kill some and to take the others to Auschwitz. So this shows the vastness of the Holocaust.
I've read those files. So Panchev investigated the the transport to Norway, and I've read the accounts of prisoners being dumped down a cliff in the winter, and suddenly, you know, everything starting to rot in the spring. And Panchev also went on to look at the Papenburg, Emsland series of camps as well, and he investigated the Harold massacre, where the Himmler kill order was actually enacted. Yeah, I mean, the vastness, and I think to some degree people maybe try to comfort themselves thinking that it all just happened in Poland somehow, but as a French newspaper said, has it not been the case that the Holocaust happened on our own? There was a silent Holocaust on our own streets and we did not notice. So this is describing the Holocaust around the Boulogne-Dancamier area in France. And that's very, very apt. And once again, for Alderney, it's the same. You know, was there not a local Holocaust that we simply didn't notice?
So I just have a quick question. So there were other German soldiers that fled, officers that fled in 1944, I believe, from the island. Were they ever spoken to, interviewed for the record's sake?
So the only Germans who were collared for war crimes were the SS Totenkopf regiment on Alderney. So the organisation TOT members got away with it, even though they're actually more vicious, it would appear, in 1942 than the SS. Some trials took place for crimes in other camps. So SS man Klebeck got tried for his crimes in the Hanover area, but there was no mention made of Alderney. For the most part, the trials of war criminals took place in other jurisdictions and did not involve Alderney. So I think Steckel, when he saw the Eichmann evidence, saw this, I suspect that there was his book was intended as a provocation towards the British government.
I think it said that survivors were spoken to, but I'm just curious if any Jewish families had come forward believing that their family members had been sent to Alderney and were buried there.
So four of the official 8 graves were exhumed by family members after the war and removed to Jewish burial places in France. The 4 remaining official Jewish burials went to a French war grave. Initially, they were going to send them to be part of the German war dead, and there was an outcry. So, alternative accommodation in a Jewish section was arranged for them. I would also comment that there's a big cemetery in Normandy where the Alderney war dead went to, and there's some very odd things about that. So some of the names that were on the crosses are on the walls of the crypt, but the prisoners who were unknowns on the official list are listed in that cemetery as unknown German soldiers. I don't know whether they didn't have a plaque for unknown Russian, but people who in the British cemetery list produced by the War Graves Commission end up being called unknown German soldiers. I mean, it's very, very bizarre, and the numbers in there don't seem to match up. I should also mention that the Ray Godian said to me that far more than 300 sets of skeletal remains were removed from the cemetery. I interviewed him 3 times on this, and the last time, 2 weeks before he thought he was going to die from cancer, he said at the end of the exhumation, several lorry loads, truckloads were removed. I said, did you say 1 truckload? And he said several truckloads were removed. So we don't really know how many remains were taken from the common, because that information is surprisingly missing.
Short question.
One comment and one question. The comment is that the narrative, the qualitative essence of this is actually, to me, just as interesting, if not more interesting, than the quantitative spaces. And so I'd love to hear whatever, and quote you just gave, and those types of quotes are really quite important, and so it brings it out in ways that sometimes the quantitative gets lost in there. The question is, how many people still live in the island? How come, what is their relationship with this as a defining all aspects of perhaps the island in some ways, and why does the government really want to hide this? That's not really quite clear to me.
Yeah, well, the thing is, there are 2,000 islanders. The islanders joke among themselves that they're 2,000 alcoholics clinging to a rock, is the local joke. The local islanders are generally quite well disposed to the sorts of things I'm saying, because the returning islanders, particularly those who'd helped the clear up operation, knew, quite a lot of what had gone on unofficially. So within the core islands themselves, they had a shrewd idea of what was going on, and they say to me, you can't have these hundreds of concrete constructions just constructed by 4,000 starving labour. It just doesn't make sense. So they have a fairly shrewd idea. Some of the so-called blow-ins and newcomers who arrived in the 70s to retire to Alderney are said to not like that so much because it's their kind of fantasy island, lovely Alderney. I mean, it's great. You go to Alderney and it's like stepping in a time machine. It's 1970 again. It's social attitudes that had disappeared long ago. So so the islands are quite positive. But this is really an off-island issue. The islanders talk about on-island and off-island. The islanders never cover this up. They're as much victims of any cover-up as anyone else. And certainly it's emphasised to me that this needs to be dealt with as an off-island issue, which is why clearly the government were involved with it. So there was another part to your question, I think.
Why is the government really wanting to hide this? It's not clear.
Yeah, well, it's all about national narratives. Every country has its own national myth or narrative. We are the good guys. There's so-called British exceptionalism. We were the moral victors of World War II, and also in recent years, the government are keen to say that we're Holocaust rescuers. So the kinder transport is wheeled out on a regular basis. We saved 10,000 children. It doesn't mention the fact that the parents were not allowed to come, and 50% of the children were orphaned by the end of the war. They suffered gross dislocation. And of course, whilst the government provided the places, private individuals, Jewish communities had to provide £50 a head to provide their return fare to where they come from at the end of the war, and they had to provide homes, support, accommodation. So without incredible work by the Jewish community and its allies and supporters, they wouldn't have got half of the kids over here. And also, let's not forget that the first shots in World War II were fired against Jewish would-be emigrants to Israel, to the British mandate to Palestine. So the first two British victims of the British were Jews trying to get to Palestine. We had approximately 19 camps for Jews arrested while trying to make illegal aliyah. The Bobasan camp in Mauritius had an 8.9% death rate. It was in a rather nasty swamp. Conditions were not good. So lots of Jews had to spend the war in distant places. I think there was one in Australia as well. So, and also our own indiscriminate internment of Jews in 1940 is shouldn't be a matter of national pride. In fact, I found out 3 weeks ago that Wharf Mills near Manchester was a transit camp on the way to the Isle of Man. Jewish prisoners who just got out of Dachau ended up there and said it was worse than Dachau, and several of them committed suicide. So, it was not all good. In fact, there was widespread anti-Semitism in the UK. The public observation exercises noted the danger of a public reaction to too many Jews being allowed in the country, whilst Churchill was generally quite surprisingly pro-Jewish. Big chunks of the Foreign Office were solidly pro-Arab and anti-Semitic. And at the end of the war, they were the ones saying, oh, these Jews, they're exaggerating accounts of the Holocaust and making things up. So it's a complicated picture. And of course, we've got the new Holocaust Memorial, which is going to be set up right next to Parliament. The plan for the memorial says that the proximity to Parliament is to enable us to show that British Parliament is a beacon of freedom and democracy. So I'm not sure there'll be too much talk about the Channel Islands or of the collaboration in the Channel Islands. So many allegations of collaboration in the Channel Islands. And of course, Alderney away is the cordon sanitaire to stop people talking about what happened in Jersey and Guernsey, because there are actually more camps, more prisoners, more construction there. So the whole thing was just sort of political plutonium at the end of the war. It just was swept under a giant historical rug, and they just hoped it would detox over time. And I think I'm out of... No, am I? Yes.
Marcus, I want to have a further conversation with you. I just really wanted to commend you on doing this exploration in a way that is sensitive to Jewish law. Because I fear what they're going to do in trying to dig up, under the name of uncovering the rape denialism and other denialism of what just happened on October 7th, I think they'll try to dig up. And you talked about all that we can learn without doing that in respect to Jewish law. I also just want, in addition to thanking you, to remind people that tomorrow you're going to be giving a tour here. So we should be meeting at 10:30 in the morning to take that tour with you of Oxford. That's it.
Yeah, and welcome. It'll be about an hour and a half to us, but if you need to wander off before, I won't be offended. You know, easy come, easy go.
10:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
Tomorrow.
Yeah.
So Marcus, on behalf of everybody, thank you.
Thank
for all
you.
the work
Yeah.
you've done.
Thank you.